The loosely translated name of the Vral cruiser was the Devouring Maw. It was a sleek war machine, having fought in 4 regional wars against the Vral's neighbors. It held the singular distinction of being the first to fire on the Tulinak homeworld 300 years prior. The sight of the Devouring Maw was a glimpse of terror. Built to not only look like a pure weapon of war, but to be armed like it as well. Disruptor cannons lined the outer hull. Missile silos built to launch the city block-sized hunter-killer missile lined its centerline, sweeping along the arch of the cruiser's 5-kilometer-long spine. It had dorsal, front, and aft launchers to launch the fast-moving torpedoes called Gullhawks, which had gotten their name from another dead empire. Its primary weapons, tri-barreled laser batteries, were built to unleash a torrent of light and death. Long paint lines decorated the hull, one for each ship that the Devouring Maw itself had claimed a kill for. So many that if the cruiser was compared side by side with a fresh cruiser of the same design, it appeared the two were painted with different styles in mind. For 300 years, the Devouring Maw had either been directly in a war zone or had been stationed at a border to be part of the armored fist when war was declared on another victim of the Vral's expansionism. It had been at the front for 6 invasions, but for the last 90 years it had been stationed at the border of the Piranesti Commune, waiting for a war to end that seemed to refuse to end. For 90 years the guns of the Devouring Maw had remained silent. Finally, the Devouring Maw was reassigned, sent to the endless war to fight the enemy that had dared to resist the Vral for so long. If a machine had a soul, the Devouring Maw would have been eager, ready, almost salivating at the chance to deal death again. As the crew of the Devouring Maw engaged this new enemy, in long, dagger-like ships, the crew was increasingly frustrated. The missiles would launch and never reach their destination, shot down by point defense. The torpedoes would sail past their targets of intent, confused by signal interference to explode uselessly in the vacuum of space. The disruptors and laser batteries would strike true, only to seemingly do nothing against armor that was purpose-built to disappoint the Devouring Maw's energy-based arsenal. If a machine had a soul, the Devouring Maw would have been raging against this new enemy. Until, of course, that enemy glanced its way. The Devouring Maw, the Vral cruiser that had killed hundreds of ships that dared to stand against it, didn't understand what was happening to it, even while it was happening. A sudden hail of shells impacting the shields caused the crew to panic, watching as the power of the protective barrier was being stripped away, and, more importantly, what was stripping them away. If the ship had a soul, it would be shrieking in terror, as it realized that after a life of mercilessly hunting down prey, it itself had flown into the jaws of a much more malicious predator. The instant the crew began to react to the battering of the shields, a shell the size of a freight container slammed into the shield wall and pierced through as if it were paper. The hull armor didn't even slow the massive shell, and the Devouring Maw lost power almost instantly as the precise strike blasted through the engineering section and blasted an exit wound out of the other side of the cruiser so large a corvette could fit inside. Another massive shell hammered straight through the spine of the ship, and the entire frame of the cruiser seemed to buck violently, the hull screaming. In less time than it takes to breathe in, the Devouring Maw had been rendered broken, helpless. As the Vral crew that survived desperately tried to determine how badly they were hurt, a few looked through viewing ports or displays that were flickering with the first pulses of auxiliary power, just in time to see an avatar of war turn its gaze from them. Any relief was short-lived, for as the guns of the Antares shifted to a new target, a single trail of vapor was seen. The Vral who noticed it stopped trying, watching the missile approach, and waited for the end. On the bridge, Field Marshal Simmons didn't even look as the Vral cruiser met its end, blasted almost cleanly in half by the El Reno-class missile. Her attention was focused on the wider war. "Richards, you've got 4 heavy cruisers trying to bear down on the Dagger," she said into her headset, while to her left and right officers with ranks of commander to admiral stood bent over the same large circular table, issuing commands to their own weapons teams. She heard Richards reply and looked his way. He flipped a control switch on his headset and began speaking rapidly to his team while manipulating the displays in front of him. A few moments later, as she turned her attention down to the displays that she commanded, She watched as the lead heavy cruiser was blanketed by a torrent of laser battery fire. The Antares could, of course, focus all of its firepower on a single target. That would be pointless, however, overkill to the extreme. Instead, the weapons of the Antares were split into multiple groups, organized into overlapping zones of control. The operational brain of the Antares had dozens of commanders issuing orders to their assigned weapons ports. 12-point defense areas of responsibility had their own overseeing captains. In different areas of the Antares, over 100 flight commanders directed thousands of strike craft, split into tactical wings with their own overseers. Each individual aspect of the ship ran in a chain, just as Thermopylae had done. In fact, many of the men and women around the table with her had served on Thermopylae itself. 3 admirals stationed at her 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock positions around the table had their jobs as well, watching the overall battle and making calls much the same as she had just done. Simmons' job was to direct the fleet, but in times like this, she only stepped in if she felt like it was needed. She trusted her ship captains. She trusted her commanders around this table. She trusted her fleet. That was why, during times like this, she had to fight off the urge to start calling shots. What good is trust if it's not shown? No, at times like these, she made it a point to simply direct attention if she felt it were needed, to see things that others were too preoccupied to see. At times like these, she watched. Almost as an afterthought, she reached down and pressed an icon on her display, hearing a click in her right ear. "Shield status, Admiral?" she asked, almost conversationally. "Shields are at 87% and increasing," came the reply from a station she knew was almost 20 kilometers away. "Reserve generators are charged and ready." She nodded to herself as the Admiral on the other end of her comms continued. "Is the fight going well, ma'am?" "Very well," she replied. "Keep up the good work." "Of course, ma'am," the Admiral replied, and Simmons reached down and tapped a subscreen, bringing up a new list of icons on her display. "TACCOM, this is Antares," she said, speaking to the strike tactical commander. "How are my rabble-rousers doing out there?" She actually leaned against the table out of habit when talking to the leader of the strike craft wings. "Glad you asked, Field Marshal," a woman's voice came on the line, and she grinned hearing Admiral Shelby. "Strike is being itself, but I need some priority put on the shit cans. I can't send anyone within 5 kilometers of any of them, and they are starting to catch on." By shit cans, Shelby was talking about a specific class of destroyer. Field Marshal Simmons quickly brought up the design, a blade-like picket destroyer with an alarming amount of point defense laser turrets. She always had found amusement in the nicknames most had given Vral ships. Shitcan was the name for the Shivada-class destroyer. There was a host of classes, and a lot of inventive people to mock them. "I'll get on it," Simmons said. "How are the losses?" "Not as good as I wanted, better than I'd hoped," Shelby said. "We are close to having strike dominance, but those little nut-huggers won't let go." Simmons blinked, and she almost asked if Shelby was sure. Strike dominance at this stage in the fight meant that Shelby's pilots were on the verge of sweeping the Vral strike elements completely off the board. The Antares could knock out ship after ship with Mac and railgun volleys, but the rest of the fleet would only be able to take down one at a time. The Vral might be able to get off the field with a significant portion of their fleet intact. If they took strike dominance, though, that meant the strike craft could slide just under the speed threshold where the Vral shields solidified to protect their ships. The second strike dominance was achieved. If the Vral tried to cut and run at all, they'd have a swarm of fighters and light bombers devouring their drive sections. "Sounds good, get your flights ready," Simmons said, and once more she changed her icons. She cast her eyes over the field and looked over the flow of the battle. Antares had jumped into the system at a 3-1 numerical disadvantage, and it was at 2-1 now. Her fleet losses were there, but out of the ships that had been taken out of the fight, only a small fraction had actually been destroyed. The Vral weren't killing the ships they had taken out. They were trying to disable them and shifting targets the second a Terran front ship was unable to fight back anymore. Long gone were the days the Vral felt comfortable enough to turn ships into scrap metal. As Simmons cast her eyes over the battle, she felt a grin slowly spreading on her face. Strike dominance now meant this Vral fleet was going to be eliminated from the battleships to the corvettes. The numbers of her dead were low, The Vral were losing this engagement. Even now, she could see the beginnings of a fighting retreat beginning to form in the lines. She could sense the retreat coming. She could smell it. Blood was in the water, and she had tens of thousands of hungry piranhas waiting to pounce. Her finger hammered down on the icon for fleet-wide transmission. "All commanders, this is the fleet. Stand and heed. Shift course to my heading," she said as she hammered in a path directly into the heart of the Vral lines. Her table had gone silent, all eyes turning to her. "Target priorities are reassigned as follows. I want every Shivota-class destroyer on the field dead or dying in the next 5 minutes. If you can't reach one of them, eliminate anything cruiserweight and above." The commanders at her table began to quickly search their areas of responsibility, some of them already speaking into their headsets. "The goal is strike dominance. Get it done." As one, the Terran fleet turned and drive plumes lit up, driving the entire Terran fleet like a fist into the Vral. Simmons watched in silence, interrupted every so often by status checks, as systematically her fleet began exterminating the picket destroyers. As the Vral tried to flex their lines in the face of the sudden advance, they seemed to realize what Simmons was up to, and the Vral fleet began to burn hard towards the jump point for the Kazitka system. What was beginning to become a fighting retreat turned into a rout. Simmons watched with a slight grin on her face, unchanging as swarms of Terran strike craft suddenly began swooping into the larger wakes of the Vral fleet. One by one, their drive plumes sputtered and went out. Within the hour, the rout turned into a massacre. Simmons stood by for it all. Urgent calls slowly became less urgent. Her own losses in her fleet slowed to a crawl, then almost stopped completely as less and less of the Vral fleet were able to fight back. Her own fleet turned from killing the Vral fleet to disabling them to be returned to later, doing its best to keep up with the fleeing ships. As she watched yet another Vral ship begin to drift as railgun rounds turned its hull into a graveyard, she reached down and lightly tapped on her display. She keyed her headset. "This is the TF Antares to all hostile ships." She saw several heads within range of her voice come up, looking to her quizzically. "Your fleet is lost. Surrender now and we will spare your lives. You will not be mistreated. You will not be tortured or put on display. You will not be enslaved. Do it not, and I will exterminate you." A few of them looked at her in surprise, but more than a few nodded their heads once, then went back to their duties. She wanted them to surrender. She wanted them to beg for mercy. She wanted desperate pleas like they had caused so many others to scream to come from their mouths, begging for her to stop. She might have actually entertained the notion of allowing them to leave on transports and not keeping them as prisoners of war. More than anything, though, she wanted them to reject her offer. She wanted to kill them all. As time went on, however, her grin turned into a sneer. No messages came from the Vral ships, no quarter was asked, none was given. Celebrations were already beginning to kick off even as the last 100 Vral ships were still being erased from existence. On the bridge of the Antares, Simmons herself was stopping each of her warfare leaders mid-task, congratulating them on a job well done. She took another hand, putting her free hand on the shoulder of the man in front of her, a rather young-looking commander. "Excellent work today, Sharp." He nodded, but something in the depth of his gray eyes held her for a moment. "Is something troubling you, Commander?" He said nothing, but something about the way he was looking at her bothered her. Simmons raised a brow, then used her hand still holding his to draw him away from the table. She looked past him to one of the captains she had spoken to earlier and raised her hand, signaling that whatever it was, it could wait. The captain nodded once, then stood by. "What's on your mind, Commander Sharp? Rank is off the board," she asked, stepping into him so their conversation would not be overheard. His eyes widened a bit in what she could only see as alarm, and she didn't blame him. He had attracted the attention of the most powerful eyes not only on his ship and his fleet, but probably in the entire military. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but why did you give the Vral a chance to surrender?" He was trying to appear calm, just inquisitive, but she could see there was a lot of hesitation to speak with her, especially about this. Her offer had bothered him. No, it had pissed him right off. He was masking it well, but there was a lot of bitterness in the way he was holding himself. There was a lot more he was trying to hide, probably anger, and she understood why. He didn't understand, he probably felt betrayed. She never took her eyes off of his, but both of her hands came to his shoulders and she clasped them tightly. "Because we aren't them," she said, and she saw a bit of confusion suddenly creep into his expression. "Because we're not the Vral. That's why." She paused a second and lowered her head, then raised her eyes back to his. "If we had lost here, they would scream it to the heavens. They'd string up my body to the prow of their flagship. They'd torture anyone they found alive in the hulls until they got bored and either enslave the rest or just kill them for sport." He nodded at her words and was about to speak again but stopped as she continued. "When the rest of the galaxy hears about this battle, they are going to hear that we destroyed every ship, killed every Vral. They are going to hear that we exterminated them down to the last, and they are going to be terrified. And then they will hear that we reached out a hand and offered mercy." The commander said, and the moment he said it, she watched all of the conflictions about her offer to the Vral vanish. She grinned up at Commander Sharp, squeezing his shoulders. "They'll hear we didn't just offer mercy, we offered fair treatment. And they will know that we aren't the Vral. They aren't watching one horror die only to be replaced by another," Simmons said, and Sharp nodded. "They need to know that. Because when we push into Vral space, we want them to know that they aren't next. They need to know that they haven't traded one monster for another one. Now don't get me wrong, we are monsters," she said, and he grinned at that. "But they need to know that we're the right kind of monster. The kind they can trust, the kind they can rely on." Sharp nodded at her again, a growing grin on his features. "Because we aren't and will never be the Vral," he said, and she nodded. "Thank you for helping me understand, Fleet Marshal." Sharp. "I trust my crew. I want them to trust me. If you ever have a question like this again, just ask. Better you get the clarification you need rather than letting it stew." Simmons released his shoulders and Sharp snapped to attention, only turning at a nod from Simmons. She went back to the table, spreading her hands and pressing them to either side of her display, watching as the fleet began to turn from a war setting to one of salvage and recovery, but more importantly, planetary assault. There was time, though, to do this one thing. With a few taps on the display, she brought up the TFS Velocore. Minor damage rode along her starboard side, where it looked like a Vral disruptor bank had gotten through their shields. From the reports, it was mostly cosmetic. "Comms," she said into her headset. "Patch my station through to the Velocore, and get someone up here to rig this thing where I can do this sort of thing myself." She said, "Kind of silly to be able to address the fleet, but not individual ships." She heard her comms key up for a second, but all she heard was a low chuckle for a few moments before an acknowledgement of her orders. A few moments later, a gruff-sounding voice spoke into her right ear. "This is Velocore OOD. Officer of the deck, this is Fleet," she said, and on the other end of the line she heard the officer of the deck on duty on the Velocore hitch their breath for a moment. "What can we do for you, Field Marshal?" "Is the crew of that ship that sent us the drone feed back on board?" Simmons asked, leaning back and glancing around the table, watching as her officers began the long and laborious process of getting the fleet put back together after a heavy engagement. "Checking on that, ma'am," came the reply. After a few seconds of silence, the line became active again. "Ma'am, the crew of the Thumper is currently still on board the Barrowmore. One of the crew was injured bringing us the scout data." "Not seriously, I hope?" Simmons asked, leaning back and bringing back up the data pack on her screen that had started all this. She tapped play as drone footage showed the inside of the lane, then an absolutely nauseating series of maneuvers made all the more nauseating by the epilepsy-inducing light show that was the god alone knows how many ships trying to kill it. Whoever had piloted this drone had been absolutely unrelenting. "No, ma'am, high G-force-related injuries," the OOD on the Velocore replied, even as the footage showed that the drone had stopped. She saw some of the ships of the fleet she had just destroyed, saw the first probe launched from the drone and the sudden influx of information. The drone's camera feed was pointed straight at the Mandeville Point as 3 corvettes entered the lane to chase down the Thumper. The drone began a blistering set of turns and accelerations, decelerations, and rolls. The crew on board the Thumper had stayed until the entire scan of the system was done, and then had been nearly destroyed even as they sent their data over to be processed. If they had lost the drone or cut and ran before it was done processing the data, there was no chance she would have brought her fleet to this system for another few days. They had stayed with death coming quickly, risked themselves, and one of them had in the end been hurt. In doing that, they had been the catalyst for this entire battle, which she already knew based on the initial jump-in alone was going to be decisive in this war, and they had won and won massively. Good, here's what I want. She began talking and she shut down the display. All around her, as she gave her orders to the Velicor's officer of the deck, damage report assessments began to come in from every corner of the fleet. Damaged ships were given orders to withdraw or to dock with Antares. Salvagers were dispatched to harvest the wrecks of Vral ships for alloys, and the manufacturing centers prepared to begin building ammunition to replace what had been expended. The battleship Blade of Hope was given first rights to dock with Antares to repair its drive section. Several tugs were dispatched to bring the ships too damaged to move independently to planetary orbit. Fast runners were dispatched to run down the fighters who had been damaged but still read pilot life signs, and at the corner of the system, the signs of a large fleet began to show at the Mandeville Point. Having had no part to play in any of the fleet battle that had just occurred, General Sia had been at his own small terminal, the Chua general working as fast and as hard as he could, alongside his own general staff. It wasn't the best plan, he would admit, but it was a plan, and he could live with it. He heard the call that his fleet was in lane and would arrive soon, and he looked over to the tactical table where Simmons stood. She was speaking with another officer, but she glanced over and saw him standing there. She said something to the officer and walked briskly over. "General, your fleet is coming in?" she asked, and he bobbed his head. Then he motioned for her to follow. As she reached his terminal, she kneeled down to look at the screen he had been working on. "Just show me what you need from me. You'll have it." Slowly, the Chua turned, and he grinned.